Outside of Florida, New York, immigration isn't a topic you hear much about in the African-American community, but the passage of Arizona's controversial immigration law brought back to light two familiar issues for many African-Americans, especially black men: racial profiling and high levels of unemployment. Here to put a black perspective on immigration reform is Wade Henderson, CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Wade, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Immigration. Let me tell you something. When I had my show on WVON, whenever we talked about this issue, I can tell you 9.5 out of 10 black folks were absolutely against amnesty. They were saying send them back. And so this is a contentious issue in the African-American community.
It's a very contentious issue, Roland, and you were right when you said that the Arizona immigration law has really brought this issue back to the national scene. But let me remind you that immigration is a national issue. It's not a partisan issue. And African Americans have a stake in developing policies for our country that not only benefit the whole, but also focus on our communities as well. We're encouraging African Americans to take a more, what we think, enlightened and progressive view. I'm very pleased that organizations like the NAACP and the Urban League, particularly at the leadership level, recognize the importance of immigration reform, but it's also important to educate the rank and file as well. Now, let me tell you why it's important for African Americans. First, it's important because we are concerned about jobs. Jobs is the #1 issue facing our community. We want to make certain that jobs are available to African Americans, and we need to do a couple of things to do it. First, we need to promote a public jobs program, because we certainly know that with the high volume of unemployment, what's now being done by the private sector is inadequate to respond to that problem.
But the private sector, they're the ones, frankly, on the immigration issue, who are benefiting from cheap labor.
Well, they are, and they're exploiting cheap labor, and until you close that loophole, you won't be able to help it. But let me go back. George Miller, who is chair of the House Education and Labor Committee, has a new jobs bill that would create public jobs, and estimate about 1 million jobs would be created by the bill. We're supporting it. We think it's important. But secondly, you need to close the loopholes that make it easy for employers to exploit the undocumented. And what that means is two things. One, you've got to pass a law that takes the 10 million undocumented that are currently in the country and legalizes them so that we're all on an even playing field in competing, not just for high-level jobs, but for low-wage jobs as well.
But that doesn't pose strongly even among African Americans.
Yeah.
And so how do you get around that? Because, again, look, I know what I hear from the rank and file, and they're not jumping up and down
Roland,
by saying let them in.
Roland, I don't dispute you. It's not about let them in, because the comprehensive immigration reform bill that we're supporting has a border enforcement component that tightens up the borders. Now, let me say to you, over the last several years, a number of steps have been taken to make immigration enforcement more realistic and more effective. It used to have about 2,000 Border Patrol agents on the borders, and that was only a few years ago. Now we have about 20,000. You now have a more sophisticated electronic network that helps identify the undocumented coming in, and deportations are actually working. So to the extent that there was a problem before with rampant undocumented immigration, that problem has now been addressed. But more importantly, until you really regulate the job market, until you take away the incentives for private employers to exploit the undocumented, you're never going to be effective. So that's why we're saying you've got to do a couple of things. You've got to enforce stringent laws, you've got to enforce labor laws, but you also have to deal with laws that allow workers to be misclassified as independent contractors and circumvent employment laws that are currently in the books.
I fully agree on the enforcement side, but here's what often happens and that is, I've seen it in Chicago, where Congressman Luis Gutierrez and others, they say, hey, these raids are not right, they're not proper. So how in the world can we talk about enforcement? And that is, if people are here illegally, raiding businesses and pulling them out, and then say, well, that's bad. In South Carolina, the Wall Street Journal did a piece a couple of years ago on a company, a lot of illegal immigrants. They raided the facility, 75, 80% were moved out. It forced the employer to go out, recruit African Americans in that particular town. What happened? All jobs filled. So you have people who would say, yeah, enforcement, but then you have Latinos who say, hey, wrong enforcement.
Look, you're going to get that. I mean, obviously, groups are going to speak to interests that sometimes affect only their particular concerns. But I think the larger issue, and the issue that Congress is looking at, the administration, and those of us who are working in public policy, is we recognize there has to be a balance. If you're going to legalize 10.5 million undocumented persons who are currently here, then you also have to have a concomitant approach to border enforcement and interior enforcement to make sure that persons who are taking advantage of the system improperly are not permitted to do that. African Americans have interests in resolving the immigration debate. Those interests are no different than other Americans who are concerned about the effects of rampant immigration. But we do it in a comprehensive and thoughtful way, and we can do it in a way that actually works to the advantage not only of our communities, but for the country as a whole.
10 seconds real quick.
Sure.
Are you going to see black folks boycott Arizona?
I think you are going to see black folks boycott Arizona because it's an outrageous law, and you have been right to criticize it. We're pleased about what you're saying.
All right, Wade Henderson, we appreciate it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
All right.